The aftermath of the 7 Years' War caused racially driven conflict in the colonies as Native Americans resisted British occupation. This hostility forced Britain to pass the Royal Proclamation of 1763, a document that ended up changing the course of Indigenous rights in North America forever. In February of 1763, the Treaty of Paris ended the 7 Years' War and ushered in a massive shift in power, as it granted all land east of the Mississippi River to Great Britain. But the treaty ignored the indigenous peoples of North America. Now that they were under British control and colonists were already trickling westward to access the new farmland and resources available, the indigenous people feared for their sovereignty. In Pontiac's rebellion, a dozen native tribes banded together and attacked colonial communities near the Great Lakes to try to protect their sovereignty. As indigenous peoples stood up for their rights, colonists also grew violent. In 1763, the Paxton Boys murdered a group of Native Americans as they prayed near Lancaster, Pennsylvania. On October 7th, King George III passed the Royal Proclamation of 1763 in the hopes it would help end the racial conflict. Britain did not want to have to pay to send British troops to keep peace in the colonies. The document set a boundary line, known as the Proclamation Line of 1763, to divide the colonies from the western frontier along the eastern continental divide and the Appalachian Mountains. The western frontier was reserved for Native Americans. The proclamation stated that indigenous peoples could not be harassed or exploited by colonists, and only the government could purchase land. The proclamation also said that, because of the frauds that individuals committed when purchasing indigenous land, from then forward, only the British government could purchase land from indigenous peoples to maintain positive relationships in peace.
Beginning, there was a promise that the Crown would support and protect indigenous nations from the behavior of colonial governments.
Since the government was making treaties to purchase land from the indigenous peoples, they were considered landowners and their rights were recognized as such. Although indigenous people still had restricted rights, it was a step in the right direction. They were sovereign and protected under law. The U.S. disregarded these rules as they moved towards independence, but they remain relevant in Canada. By setting a legal framework where indigenous people were considered landowners, the proclamation set a precedent for future treaty making and expanded the figurative indigenous peoples' rights frontier. For some indigenous people, the Royal Proclamation of 1763 is so momentous that it is called the Indian Magna Carta. Its proponents argue that it was as fundamental for the indigenous people's rights frontier as the Magna Carta was for the foundation of constitutional governments. Back in the colonies, when the proclamation was first issued, it irritated colonists by posing a legal challenge for acquiring land in the West. The proclamation allowed for some new settlement by creating the territories of Quebec, West and East Florida, and Grenada. However, it forbade settlement in the western frontier. The Ohio River Valley was designated for Native Americans, and colonists would no longer be allowed to move westward. Those already in the West were supposed to move back. One British leader, when asked to grant land patents, said, "I do not mean to grant any patents on the western waters, as I do not think I am at present empowered to do so." The wording of the Royal Proclamation of 1763 meant that all the land in the western frontier belonged to the Native Americans. Previously, wealthy gentry had invested in land-based companies, which bought land in the West and resold it at a higher price. But they could no longer get the titles they needed. Individuals were also forbidden from purchasing land from the Native Americans. In the Transylvania Purchase, for example, an individual tried to purchase Cherokee land, but his ownership was not recognized by the British government. The Royal Proclamation was viewed as restrictive and invasive. Britain was interfering in colonial affairs from across the sea. The proclamation prevented economic opportunities for the wealthy, since they could no longer invest in land-based companies, and it benefited Britain's mercantile economy, irritating colonists. Beyond frustrating colonists, the proclamation was not taken seriously. Colonists felt justified in moving westward because they had fought in the 7 Years' War, winning the land for Britain. They felt that the proclamation was merely passed to appease native peoples. Echoing the belief of many, George Washington said that he considered the proclamation a temporary expedient to pacify the Native Americans, and that he felt individuals should go ahead and claim land in the western frontier before the opportunity elapsed. For instance, Daniel Boone, shown here, cut the Cumberland Gap in 1775, which was a violation of the proclamation. When the U.S. declared independence from Great Britain, they got rid of the line entirely to allow for westward expansion. However, later U.S. legislation was influenced by the Royal Proclamation. In the Supreme Court case Johnson v. McIntosh in 1823, for example, the Supreme Court reinforced the policy that only the government, although this time the United States government, would be allowed to purchase land from the Native Americans, and that individual land purchases would not be recognized. Along with Worcester v. Georgia and Cherokee Nation v. Georgia, the cases make up the Marshall Trilogy and the foundation of Native American land rights and tribal sovereignty within the U.S. While these are critical components of modern cases and campaigns, it is important to note that the United States' history of following its own decisions is very flawed. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 blatantly disregarded the verdicts of the Marshall Trilogy, beginning the Trail of Tears. Unlike the US, the proclamation has a resounding legal influence in Canada, which remained a part of the British Empire. In 1764, a meeting between Britain and a few dozen Indigenous troops was held at Niagara. British officials explained the proclamation to tribal leaders, and treaties and agreements were made. Wampum belts, like the one shown here, were exchanged, symbolizing the treaties. This set a peaceful precedent for treaty making in the future. After the Revolutionary War, Britain made treaties with the Ojibwe and Anishinaabe peoples near the Great Lakes to gain territory to give to incoming settlers. In return, they reserved lands nearby for the Indigenous people in Canada. Today, the Proclamation of 1763 is enshrined in Section 25 of the Constitution Act in Canada. The document says that rights and freedoms recognized by the Royal Proclamation of October 7, 1763 are still recognized today. Essentially, Canadian law says that, per the Royal Proclamation of 1763, Indigenous peoples' rights cannot be restricted.
It's very important to recognize that over 250 years, the Royal Proclamation has been that golden thread that ties all the foundational documents that represent this idea of Canada together and create an ongoing responsibility to recognize the spirit and intent of the original relationship.
The proclamation's 250th anniversary was celebrated with meetings in London and Ottawa in 2013. But for others, the proclamation's anniversary simply served as a reminder of the government's broken promises and the historical and ongoing challenges faced by Indigenous peoples. Events such as Canada's residential school system and other colonial oppressions have led to ongoing socio-economic issues for Indigenous peoples.
That we will defend our land, our water, our bodies, our stories, our collective future, which is rooted in this sacred responsibility of sovereignty and self-determination.
Many Indigenous people gathered in protest on October 7, 2013 in Canada to raise awareness. They urged the government to protect Indigenous land, water, and resources from pollution and destruction, as was promised by the proclamation. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 began as a physical frontier, the Proclamation Line, which separated the colonists from the lands reserved for Indigenous peoples in the West. By forbidding colonists from moving west of the Appalachian Mountains, the British hoped to reduce conflict with the Native Americans and secure future peace. At the time it was issued, it irritated colonists and helped spark the frustration that led to the American Revolution. While the line was not enforced or respected, the ideals of the proclamation live on. It marked the first time Indigenous peoples were recognized as sovereign and landowners, so it set a precedent for treaty making and redefined Indigenous-Crown relationships, since Indigenous people were considered political entities. The wording of the proclamation influenced American court cases and legislation protecting Native Americans. In Canada, the proclamation is considered a foundational constitutional document, and it provides the legal framework for Indigenous people's rights. The spirit of the proclamation wasn't always upheld, as both countries' histories of oppression demonstrate, but it provides the legal support for ongoing Indigenous rights movements. The Indian Magna Carta is the foundation of the Indigenous people's rights frontier, and it set the stage for their rights and treatment today. Although it was issued over 250 years ago in a different era, the proclamation remains relevant. Ongoing campaigns and court cases in both countries echo back to the principles of the proclamation, that Indigenous people could live under their own governance on their own land and would be protected.
Fight for the rights of our people. Fight for the rights of our people. For our people, for our future people.